Welcome to the Same Day Podcast, where we discuss driving incremental business growth and other topics related to real estate, property management, and entrepreneurship. Now to the show at hand.
Matt Zalk here. I'm the host of the Same Day Podcast, where I connect with top business leaders and real estate experts. Today's show is brought to you by Keyrenter Property Management. At Keyrenter Property Management, we are a full-service property management company helping our clients buy, renovate, and operate real estate assets. We help our clients build wealth while taking the headache out of property management. No matter what rental you have, single-family homes, condos, townhomes, apartments, we have the management solutions you need. Go to KeyrenterTulsa.com, KeyrenterOklahomaCity.com, KeyrenterArkansas.com, or just go to KeyrenterPMC.com and you'll get all those websites. Or email us at info@KeyrenterPMC.com. Today, I've got Chad Franzen here of Rise 25, who's done hundreds, maybe thousands of interviews with successful entrepreneurs, investors, and CEOs. And we've flipped the script and he's going to be interviewing me. Welcome, Chad.
Hey, Matt, thanks so much. Great to be here. Hey, I wanted to get into deferred maintenance a little bit with you today. If you could, just from your standpoint, give me a broad definition of what deferred maintenance is and why people often consider it to be a good option.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, deferred maintenance is anything that should be done to a property that has not been done. It could be not cutting back trees. It could be exterior paint. It could be interior paint. It could be doors that are settling because of foundation issues. It could be not properly augering or jetting your plumbing lines. There's really a host of issues that just have to be done at any property over time to make sure that it continues to be functional. And owners often don't want to do those issues because they're tight on cash flow today, or because they don't see it as a real issue. It doesn't bother them, whereas it might bother a tenant that moves into the property. But I think mostly it's because people just don't want to spend the money. And it's our perspective is a stitch in time saves nine. If you don't deal with it today, it will probably continue to get worse over time.
So it'll become more expensive if somebody waits 6 months.
Yeah, and I think the best example of that is an exterior coat of paint on wood siding or wood soffit or wood fascia needs to be redone with relative frequency. That might be every 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. And if you don't keep that wood coated with paint over time, it begins to rot. Think, for example, about trim of doors on exterior areas of the house. When water splashes up, if you don't have proper guttering, for example, and water splashes off the roof and splashes back onto that trim, over time it will degrade the paint, and over time it will rot the wood. And that becomes an issue. It will climb up and up and up as water gets wicked up higher, for example. And so that it will just rot and look bad over time. If it's just covered consistently with a coat of paint, that's much less likely to happen. So that's an example is wood rot. An example is making sure that your HVAC system is working effectively. That means that you've got the right pressures inside, that you've got a good level of refrigerant, making sure that you don't have cracks in your heat exchanger over time. So those are just some examples where if you do the preventative maintenance, it's much less expensive than actually deferring it and paying for it in the long run. Just to make it crystal clear, replacing a piece of trim is much more expensive than just painting the trim, because you're gonna have to paint that trim anyways. So just doing a small coat of paint on an exterior piece of trim every 3 or 4 years is much cheaper than not doing that and then having to replace the entirety of the trim. Because what happens also is that behind that trim is another piece of wood, most likely, and that wood is probably also rotting from moisture.
So let's say you have a client who or an owner that brings on a new property, and there's a maintenance issue that arises. What are some most common issues with deferred maintenance that you see in that situation?
Yeah, so when a client brings us a property, oftentimes they have not looked potentially at the use case once they move out. So they might be in a house, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and they're just a couple. Imagine a husband-wife couple, their kids have moved out, they're leaving that house, and they want to rent it to a family, to anybody. A family might move in, and that family might consist of 2 adults and 3 kids. 5 people use a house very differently than 2 people. So one thing that we see is that we would have a plumbing issue that comes about when 5 people start flushing things down the toilet. Forget for a moment that they flush things that they shouldn't be flushing. So you shouldn't flush wipes, even when they say flushable. You shouldn't be flushing anything down the toilet except waste and toilet paper, and a moderate amount of toilet paper. But if there's something like roots growing into a sewer line that's running back out of the house into an easement in the backyard somewhere, there could be roots growing into that line. And when it's just 2 people putting down a little bit of toilet paper, it's not a big deal. And when 5 people are putting down toilet paper, it often can get, the toilet paper can get snagged on a root, and that blocks up the entirety of the system. Now they might say, well, how did that happen? I've been using that house for 15 years or 10 years or 5 years, and it's never happened to me. Different use cases just cause different issues or problems with the house. We see that quite frequently. We also see it with HVAC systems. An owner might have last serviced his or her home HVAC unit 5 years ago. And over the course of 5 years, you get a little bit of corrosion, you get a little bit of a pinhole leak in the refrigerant lines in the coil, and it's just slowly leaking out refrigerant. So they give us the property after they've used the house for the winter period. They give it to us in March. We don't notice anything about refrigerant lines until April, when the tenant now that we've placed has turned on the system for the first time for the season, and we find that it's out of refrigerant. It's just serendipity that wasn't caught before. A system can work with low refrigerant, not ideal, but it can work. And then when it's out, it's out. So we have to go back and replace the refrigerant and hopefully actually fix the problem that caused the refrigerant leak in the first place. We see that quite a bit. We also see things like they didn't do a full exterior walk around of the house. And so on the side of the house where it's close to a fence, or where the tree that's on the neighbor side of the fence might have grown and is touching the roof, that's a good thing that we should cut back over time. But they might not have paid much attention, or might not have wanted to fix that issue, but the branches will start growing and start getting under the shingles of the roof, and that over time can cause leaks. Way cheaper, for example, back to our previous the previous question, way cheaper to just cut back a couple of limbs away from the roof than to have to deal with the roof leak issue, right? That you have to now change shingles. You may have to change some of the OSB underneath, and you have to fix the interior of the ceiling space, potentially deal with mold issues in the attic as a result of that water penetrating over the course of who knows what time. So those are the things that we generally see. I'm trying to think of others. Oftentimes we find that an owner will give us a house, and the interior will be all sorts of interesting colors. The owner had 2 daughters and a son. They like the pink room and the blue room, but a new tenant is not going to necessarily have the same family configuration. They might not have any kids. They might be using one room as an office, and they don't want the interior painting to be pink and blue, or I've seen all sorts of stuff, stripes, 3 colors in a room, whatever. And owner says, I don't want to pay for that to be changed. I liked it that way. Well, a tenant doesn't really like it that way. So we're willing to keep it that way if you're willing to accept that our lease guarantee, ensuring that we actually find a tenant in a reasonable amount of time, no longer applies. Or we're willing to do it if you want to lower rent by $100, or we just need to paint it because the average person that comes in that sees this house is not going to like it that way. So we have to have these tough conversations with owners occasionally who have attachments to their properties that tenants are not going to necessarily oblige.
So, my wife and I are thinking about getting another place, running this place out, just have an extra stream of income, whatever, not sell the place yet. How can we guard against having all these surprises come up, like if a family of 5 moves in here rather than just us?
Yeah, so it's hard. There are protected classes in the US, and you can't advertise a property that says no families, for example, or no people from Sri Lanka, for example. So you can't do any of that stuff. It's hard to protect against it. You certainly cannot also protect against pets coming in your property, because if somebody has an emotional support animal, they don't have to disclose it to you until you've already rented the house to them. They can just show you the paperwork, and it's very difficult to combat that. You can't say to them, I want to talk to your psychologist. The letter that they can get legally can be from anybody that is familiar with their mental health issue or any other issue that they're facing that needs an emotional support animal. It's incredibly broad. It can be a family member, it can be anything, and they can have almost any pet, a pet hamster, a pet iguana, whatever it is, almost that's reasonable, and you have to give them a reasonable accommodation. It's very hard to prevent anybody from moving into your property. You can block people for the standard screening criteria that we use: no evictions, no felonies against person or property in the last 7 years, credit score. You can do a whole bunch of things, but you can't say, I don't want a family moving into my property. You just accept that risk when you decide to rent a property. And I'll say, I leased out my primary residence last November, and we did a full analysis of our house. There were parts where, we had to take down paintings and there were holes in the walls, and we had to paint the entirety of the walls. We went through and touched up the entirety of the house. We actually left 2 weeks early so that we could do everything we needed to do, and, do some flooring repairs, do some wall touch-ups, make sure that everything was out of the house and looked good for the residents that were moving into the property. And I felt that pain, right? I would have much rather left the holes in the walls and said, take the property as is. But it just doesn't work that way, because when somebody moves out of the property, you're going to hold them accountable for the holes that they put in the wall. And you can't hold them accountable if you left them a bunch of holes in the wall. So painting after you move out of a property we were in that house from 2018 to 2022, moving out of that house after 4 years, there's just normal wear and tear at corners of walls where you've scuffed up and done things. It's just standard.
So would you say it's better then to probably have that analysis done rather than letting the new tenant analyze your property?
Yeah, and we can do that for an owner that brings on a property. We can send out a maintenance technician and provide a list of things that need to be repaired prior to renting the property. A person can do it themselves by doing a disinterested analysis or viewing of their house, right? As long as you don't say, well, that scuff's okay, and that scuff's okay, and that scuff's okay. If you're truly disinterested and you're not concerned, whether this is going to cost $50, then you can do it yourself. I think a common example of things that we find wrong with a home or deferred in terms of maintenance is a plug that doesn't work. That plug in my home, I never used because my configuration of furniture was one way, and I never cared. But a tenant that moves into a property wants things to work. Whatever you think you're getting for rent, whatever you think of that number, a tenant is generally spending 30% of their income to get into that property. And they think that's a lot of money because they might make only $2,000 a month. And so $600 is a lot of money to them. They might make $10,000 a month, and $3,500 is a good amount of money for them. They want the things that are in that property to work. And furthermore, if it's a HUD property, we're putting a Section 8 tenant in, the HUD inspector is going to require that those things work. So that plug that you never cared about needs to work. The fact that the light in your shower, maybe the vented light in the master bedroom shower doesn't work, didn't mean that much to you because you didn't take long showers, you didn't take hot showers. It never was a big deal. It didn't fog up the mirrors. But to a tenant that moves in that expects things to be working, it is a big deal to them. They take longer showers. They're paying for the water, by the way, so you don't care about that. They're taking longer showers. They're taking hotter showers, whatever it is. They expect things to work because they think they're paying good money for that property. And they are likely paying good money for that property. So there are little things that you recognized as the owner potentially that didn't bother you, or you didn't want to spend the money for an electrician to come over and fix that plug for $115 because it didn't mean anything to you because your furniture, you never use that outlet. Whereas a new tenant expects things to work and they've got a different configuration in their house and they, want that thing fixed. I think generally fixing things is a good idea.
Sure. Are there some different common issues, when somebody's been renting out a property for a while, some common issues with deferred maintenance?
Yeah. So we see, oftentimes when a property's been a rental, we see landscaping issues, we see exterior paint issues, both of which I've mentioned before, but we'll see that an owner will take greater care of the landscaping than a tenant will. That's just a fact of the business, of the industry. And generally speaking, an owner is going to take better care of their property than a tenant is. That's, think about the way you treat a rental car versus your own car. You might not floor your own car, but you might, put the pedal to the metal on a rental car and go, oh, this thing's kind of fun. So it's, renting is always, a renter is always going to use things a little bit harder and generally pay less attention and care less than an owner will. That's just the way it works. For landscaping specifically, owners might consider changing plants that need good watering on a frequent basis to, a small dwarf nandina, for example, that requires very little watering, doesn't grow to be a large plant, doesn't need constant upkeep and maintenance, just a simple plant. It looks nice. You plant a few of them in your yard and you've got nice exterior landscaping, but it doesn't require the tenant to pay a tremendous amount of attention. I've made the mistake on rentals that I've owned in the past of having a landscaper come in and do really nice landscaping. And then one tenant later, I've got to turn the property and all those plants are dead. So consider planting things that grow small, that are small bushes instead of trees, because over time, if you've got a crepe myrtle and it doesn't get trimmed back every year, and you're not the kind of owner that wants to pay for it to get trimmed back every year, it grows out of control. It's just not a good long-term solution. It looks ugly, etc. In Colorado, where we also have rental properties, personally, I've got rental properties. My sister's done this Xeriscape thing. My sister manages those properties, and she's done the Xeriscape thing where it doesn't require the tenant to mow any grass. It doesn't require the tenant to oversee the yard, etc. So there are certainly pros and cons to having nicer landscaping when you move out of a property. But I would consider, for our owners that have nicer landscaping that are transitioning those properties into rentals, it's probably a good idea to reduce some of the kind of long-term maintenance that's required for those things. And that might even mean taking down trees that are large and dropping branches on your roof and clogging your gutters and everything else. But certainly taking some of the bushes that grow large and making them into, replanting them with bushes that are smaller is a good idea.
Very interesting. So we talked about the downsides of deferring maintenance. Basically, things are probably just going to be more expensive a few months from now or a year from now than they are right now. Is there ever a time where that's not the case, and when would it be a good idea to defer maintenance?
Yeah. So the owner's cash flow position will dictate what they can do now and what they have to do later. It's just a fact of owning rentals that sometimes you're going to have more money and sometimes you're going to have less money in the slush fund or the account that houses your budget for the house. There are times when you go a month without rental income because there's a vacancy, there's a unit turn, you've got to replace a hot water heater, whatever it is, you're going to have less money. So there's sometimes when the pain of the upfront cost, the CapEx, is greater than you're willing to stand or stomach. And so you just need to defer the maintenance. You can't avoid it entirely. And you have to recognize on the front end that if you defer the maintenance, you're going to pay more generally in the long run because your operating expenses are going to be greater. Now, you don't have the CapEx, but your operating expenses are going to be greater. And at some point you will have the CapEx requirement. So you just have to make that decision. A couple of examples. The same thing with the plumbing lines with the roots growing in it. You can schedule a plumbing line to be augered or jetted every 6 months to avoid a tenant having a backup in their toilets inside the house. That's great. You can spend $150 each time you do it, $300 a year. A couple of years later, you probably will still have to replace the sewer line, and that can be $3,000, $5,000, $6,000, depending on the depth of the sewer line and how long it goes to get to the main. So if you want to defer it for a little bit, you can. You just pay $300 this year, $300 next year, and in the third year, the price of doing that sewer line replacement is probably going to be more than it is today. And you will have spent the $600 over the previous couple of years to do the ongoing maintenance required to keep that sewer line from backing up. Similar example would be HVAC. Again, if you just put in a couple of pounds of Freon refrigerant every summer, you Band-Aid the problem because it's still leaking out somewhere. If you put a couple of pounds of Freon and you solder the hole, you figure out where the hole is, you do a leak detection on the coil and you figure out where the hole is and you patch that hole, it probably just means that another hole is going to form somewhere because the condensing unit is old, the coils are old. And so you have a couple of options. You replace the entire condenser, you replace the coil, or you just Band-Aid it for a little bit. But if you don't have the cash to spend between $1,200 and $5,000 to replace the coil or the condensing unit, now spending $200 on just putting in a couple pounds of refrigerant is probably a good idea for you.
Last question for you. How big of a surprise is this general topic, all these things people might have to worry about, especially to new landlords?
I think it's not intuitively, it makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a surprise to new landlords. It's more of a surprise when something actually goes wrong and they're hit with a $2,000 bill for something. We had a property 5 years ago that there was a single guy and his girlfriend living in the property. He moved out. I think he was called back to the service and he moved out. And then a family moved into a property and we immediately had a plumbing issue. I've talked about it on this show. we've had a plumbing issue, and they were doing laundry, and laundry was back, and the lines were backing up through the like an emergency drain where in the laundry room where overflow can happen. And we had to pull back all of the carpet in the living room, jackhammer up the foundation, and replace sewer lines inside the house. And it was like a $7,000 bill. The owner was not expecting that. It's a fact of rental properties in life, frankly, but it's hard to stomach a $7,000 bill, particularly when you're on a military budget. These things just happen. And I think owners often look at us and go, you must be making this up. Well, here are all the pictures. First, we're going to scope the line. We're going to figure out we're going to camera the line and see where the issue actually is. Then we can make a decision about what we do. Sometimes there are so many roots or there are so many cracks. I mean, foundations in homes shift. And if you drop, and it can happen in the middle of a house. We have this clay soil in Oklahoma, and between dry months and wet months, your foundation can raise and lower 6 inches, which is crazy. I'd like to have Adam Sedlak on the show from Level 1 Home Foundation, and he can talk about all the things that he sees. But oftentimes you see piering that's required on the exterior of the house as things settle. But what can happen as well, which is more serious, is that in the middle of your foundation in your living room, it cracks, and that causes plumbing lines to just crack and back up. So why that happened then, I have no idea. I can only imagine that we moved a family, and after he and his girlfriend, moved out of the house, and it just caused some issues. But we had to jackhammer up from that laundry room all the way back into the living room. We had to fix the carpet afterwards. We had to pour new concrete afterwards. We had to fix the sewer, the plumbing lines, of course, and that was a big headache. So the answer to your question is the fact that things can go wrong is not generally an issue, not generally a surprise to anybody. But when things go wrong, that can really be a surprise to people, especially if it's a high ticket item.
So, okay. Now my last question. My primary takeaway, given the fact that I am considering renting this place out, my first takeaway is that I shouldn't be surprised when things aren't as great as I think they are. And then B, how much do you think is advisable just to have in reserve before we make the decision to rent the place out, so that some of these surprises can be taken care of right away? Or does it depend on the client?
Yeah. So in addition to not being surprised that things can go wrong, you can spend $400 to have a home inspector. Like when you would buy a property or sell a property, you have a home inspector come in and actually do the things that you need to do. Look at everything, look at the systems, how well are they functioning, and potentially even put a camera down the lines of your sewer system to make sure that they're okay. If you have underground ducts, for example, ducts that are air conditioning ducts that are in the foundation, as is quite common in properties that are on slab instead of on crawl space, they can camera those lines as well and tell you if you've got galvanized steel that's corroded over time that needs to be coated, if you've got other issues, breakages in the foundation that have caused breakages in the AC line. So a tenant's going to say, hey, I don't get any air conditioning into the third bedroom, which of course to you didn't matter because you didn't have somebody living in that bedroom, or it was an office space, or you were okay with a window unit, or you were okay with a fan, or you naturally just accept warmer temperatures in your house. You can have somebody do all that stuff in advance, and then you can be prepared to make those, you can escrow those funds in your personal bank account so that you have money to spend when you need to spend it. And then the second part of your question, I forget. I wanted to answer that one first. How much did you have?
Yeah.
Hard to know. I mean, I think if you look at the general expenses of a house, what's most likely, it's unlikely that you're going to have a situation that I just described where the plumbing lines need to be jackhammered up in your living room. It's more likely that you've got roots growing in your yard. And again, if you have a couple of $1,000s saved up, you can always jet the lines, as I said, and defer that maintenance until you've got a little more saved up. I think it's probably a good idea to have 2 or 3 or 4 months worth of the rent of that property, because that rent should be in excess of your mortgage payment, which means you've got enough money to pay for the mortgage if you don't have any rent income. And then it also means you've got some money saved up for the condensing unit to go out. So if you just imagine a rough rule of thumb, if you've got $2,500 a month in rent coming in Tulsa, not in Colorado, not in New York City, but if you've got $2,500 of rent coming in, it could be very likely that you've got 2 condensing units in your house. You have a zone system that has 2 units. If you have $1,200 a month in rent coming in, it's probably a smaller house, and you probably only have 1 system. So if you have 4 months of rent saved up, you probably have plenty of money to fix the condensing unit issues, and certainly you have enough so that you can pay what's immediate, so you can band-aid something if you need to defer the maintenance longer term.
Okay. Hey, Matt, great information and great insights. Thank you so much.
Chad, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Same Day Podcast. Tune in to a new show each week and be sure to subscribe to get future episodes.